Q.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. This is Faye D'Souza. We are a conversation right now on live with Faye. Just to bring you up to speed, if you don't know, it's unlikely that you don't know, that there has been an FIR that has been filed against several journalists, against the online news portal The Wire, some Congress leaders, and the social media platform Twitter. That they've been booked for allegedly promoting enmity between religions after the Ghaziabad incident, where where we know that there was an elderly gentleman, a Muslim gentleman, who was assaulted on camera, the video of which has gone viral. His beard was cut off. He spoke to several media outlets. In his statement, said very clearly that he was asked to chant slogans that were of a religious nature. The Uttar Pradesh police then came out the next day and said that there is no sort of communal angle to this, that the incident only took place because he had some unhappy customers for his business. The police then went ahead and filed an FIR against the journalists who had tweeted about that incident and against Twitter, saying that they tweeted without checking their facts and they did it to promote enmity and to sort of induce, let's say, rioting among people, because they were trying to create hatred and provoke communal sentiments. Now, there are several questions that have to be asked about the nature of this FIR. And this is really important, because is it the job of journalists to report only the police's version? Is the police's version the final version of the story? If the victim has in fact said what he did, does that merit reporting? And should journalists be worried about FIRs being filed against them in situations like this? We know the Editors Guild put out a statement to this effect, effectively saying that what this does is destroys freedom of speech. It also basically, basically makes journalists afraid of reporting incidents like this, because you don't know whether or not the police will file an FIR against you. To help us understand the details of where the law lies in matters like this, joining us this evening are three very important guests. I beg your pardon. Ms. Radhika Ramaseshan is a very senior journalist who has written for the Business Standard, the Mumbai Mirror, the Deccan Herald, in which she was political editor of the Telegraph. We also have Mr. Yashovardhan Azad, who is a very senior IPS officer who served with the police, is an award-winning police officer with distinguished service. He also served in the Intelligence Bureau as well. And we have Pratik, the co-founder of Alt News. Now, I must point out here that Pratik's co-founder, Mohammed Zubair, is one of the journalists who has been named in that FIR. I welcome all three of you to this conversation and thank you for joining us. Pratik, my first question is to you. We know that Mohammed Zubair had in fact deleted the tweets that he had put out. Could you tell us why he chose to delete them? And was there something, was there an inaccuracy in the tweets that he had put out that required them to be deleted?
No, there wasn't any inaccuracy as such. So lot of things were happening then, right? Consistently, all of these tweets were being marked. There were people in BJP and especially people associated with UP government. They were they were attacking Zubair in a very organized manner. So we thought that it is safe to delete the tweets at that point in time. This did not go out of the Alt News platform. This went out of his personal Twitter handle. And he had been speaking to police authorities on the side, and they told us the same thing, that the communal angle is not made out and all of those. And there was a lot of pressure. So, see, one of the things is also in this regime is also about self-preservation, right? So the deletion of tweets was more from a point of self-preservation as opposed to, lack of accuracy. It has been seen, what were the two tweets that Zubair put out? Number one, that a man was thrashed. There was, that is absolutely accurate, that he was thrashed. And that is also the police's version, that he was in fact beaten up by goons, okay? And Zubair specifically used the word goons. He did not attribute any religion to the people who committed the crime against Mr. Abdul Samad. The next thing he said is that the next tweet was that here's a video in which victim is narrating what he went through, and he claims that he was beaten up
Yes.
And he was forced to say Jai Shri Ram. Now, again, this is a claim in which the victim actually says this on video, and this is what Zubair has said. So in terms of inaccuracy, there is no inaccuracy at all. But sometimes you take actions for the sake of self-preservation, so that, and not just Zubair, everybody has deleted the tweets at this point in time because of the FIR that was, we were already anticipating that an FIR will be filed. So this was more in a case of self-preservation as opposed to, deletion because of inaccuracy.
Mr. Sinha, tell me something. We do know that several media houses, including various television channels, have reported the exact same thing that Zubair had tweeted. But there's been no FIR against any of the reporting. Is it accurate to say that the FIR is only against the tweets?
Absolutely. So Zubair's tweet was at 12:35 p.m. on June 19th. Times Now had a big show at 12:19 p.m. on June 14th. So 16 minutes before Zubair tweeted. And they had much more direct, their graphics said things much more directly than Zubair. Zubair just said that this is what the person is claiming. The graphics said man thrash for not saying Jai Shri Ram. Those kind of graphics were flashed on a Times Now broadcast. And Times Now has 6 million followers. Zubair has 300,000 followers. So close to 30, Times Now has 30 times more followers just on Twitter. This is just on Twitter. They have, of course, following on Facebook, YouTube, their direct broadcast. So potential of reaching people is much, much higher in case of Times Now. And they played the same videos, whatever videos, video that Zubair has put out. So it is obviously selective. There are so many organizations which showed this, but if you look at the names that have been picked up, for example, Saba Naqvi, all she did was tweet an Indian Express article. You can't even tweet an article anymore. I think Rana had put out something on Instagram. So if you look at the names, all the names are Muslim names. So many people had shared it. How is, it can't be a coincidence that every name that was chosen was a Muslim name. And then in addition, there's Wire and Twitter. And the next day, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad writes this huge thread targeting Twitter. So all of this is organized, synchronized. This is not in isolation. And it was, this has been happening again and again. This is a way to silence any kind of reporting, any kind of even dissent, but any kind of reporting. What we saw during Hathras as well, the enormous police deployment around Hathras, and the way journalists were not allowed to report things, and all the threats that came along with, if you report, this is what is going to happen. So this is a repeated thing that is happening, especially in case of reporting on Uttar Pradesh. Again, with the Ganga story also, there were implicit threats. For example, if that oxygen story, the government saying that if anybody reports about lack of oxygen, we are going to take action. So these kind of implicit and explicit threats have become a norm when it comes to reporting about Uttar Pradesh.
Mr. Sinha, let me come back to you, but first I want to bring in my other two guests. Ms. Radhika Ramaseshan is with us. Ms. Ramaseshan, thank you so much for giving us time. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you. We haven't actually spoken in a really long time, so I'm looking forward to this. And it's a very simple question, actually, that I want to ask you. If the victim of a certain crime has given a statement to the press saying, this is what happened to me, can the journalist or any other private individual be held responsible for reproducing that statement?
Certainly not. I have reported on any number of communal and caste violence in Uttar Pradesh. Let me emphasize, in Uttar Pradesh. Therefore, to contextualize, what does one do when one visits the scene of a communal or a caste crime, or any petty crime for that matter? You first talk to the victim, and if the victim is no longer around, you speak to his or her relatives and family, get their version in detail, ask questions. I know at times it's very uncomfortable, disconcerting to ask questions when, in the backdrop of a tragedy. But as journalists, that is what we have done. And what is the next step? Then you go to the police or the administration, district administration, and take their version as well. Okay, there's absolutely no dispute about the SOP, the standard operating procedure to cover such incidents. Now, I mean, and experience has taught me to be very skeptical of official versions. Of course, as a journalist, I have to sort of append it or weave it in my copy. But, I'm extremely skeptical because if you juxtapose the victims and their families' version with that of the police or the administration, questions crop up. And in many cases, the cops or the administration or the local DM or collector is not in a position to answer those questions. They kind of brush it off. They said, "Ab to aise hi hain, aise sawal पूछते हैं, तेरे मेरे सवाल पूछते हैं." This is the standard kind of answer, but we also have to put all that in the copy so that it comes out as balanced, quote unquote. In this case, there is no doubt that the victim who went through a harrowing experience, I mean, an old man who was assaulted for no reason except that he probably belongs to a certain religion. I mean, there is no way he would have lied, exaggerated, or made up anything that he said. His account is there and it is for real. There is no question about it. And, the papers that have reported have taken the official version as well, which was rather sketchy on the day that the crime happened. And in hindsight, the police gave some other version the following day. Now, since I didn't report, I'm not questioning or casting aspersions on the police's version, but there was a police version. And the journalists in question who have been implicated in this particular case, all they did was retweet newspaper reports, which
Yes.
I often do. Yeah, if something catches my attention, I retweet it. So there should be no problem with that.
So journalistically, Ms. Ramaseshan, forgive me for interrupting you. What happens if the victim's version and the police version are inconsistent? This happened, for example, in Hathras. The family's version and the police version was inconsistent. The UP police insisted that she had not been raped, that nothing had happened, and then we realized over a period of time that that was not true. So, like you said, very often these two versions are inconsistent. Very often, journalists report whatever details they have on day one, and on day two, newer details or conflicting details emerge. What are journalists supposed to do then? Can they then be held accountable for what they reported on day one?
Yeah, as journalists, we can raise questions. In case you find that the victim's report is inconsistent with that of the administration, I think we are all, most journalists and these, including those who are on the crime beat, are seasoned enough to recognize a fact from fiction or quasi-fiction. So your job is to ask questions. Don't give any answers. Just raise questions so that, the reader knows that you are not taking the official version at face value. Or, if you think that the victim has made up something, which does happen in some cases, I'm not saying it happens in all cases, it does happen in some cases, then you you express a degree of doubt, of skepticism. Skepticism is the word, and in journalism, right from journalism schools, we are taught to be skeptical about everything. Don't trust anything until you can, judge for yourself. And here, I'd just like to take you back to last year, again in Uttar Pradesh, when there was a fallout of the enforcement of love jihad. You had this case in Moradabad, a voluntary, consensual marriage between a Hindu and a Muslim, and they were arrested. The girl was sent to a remand home. She she miscarried. She was pregnant, and she miscarried her baby. And the boy was put in prison. Now, this was reported by a young journalist from Fatehpur who's on the ground and who's up and about in Uttar Pradesh. He broke the story for, I think either it was the Guardian or the Observer, I forget which one. Now, some people tweeted about it. I mean, I didn't. I asked one of my colleagues who tweeted. I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yes, I'm 100% sure that this is true." And of course, aspersions were cast by other journalists on the report. They said it's all made up. Subsequently, every word that was contained in the report turned out to be true. The officials had to accept. The boy was released from prison. The girl was sent back to her family from the remand home. So, this is how things are panning out in Uttar Pradesh. And to contextualize lastly, as we are closer to the Uttar Pradesh elections, you are going to see more and more of such incidents. Make no mistake, because the BJP, the government, needs to cover up its inadequacies in governance. So this communal card always comes in handy to the BJP. So you are going to see more. You're going to see more of, Twitter vigilantism, so to speak. More of arrests probably. There have been arrests in the past. We will come to that later. So this is how it's going to be.
And I want to come back to that because that's going to be very interesting for us to predict and what's going to happen over the next 7 months. But I want to bring in Mr. Azad. Mr. Azad, the FIR here has one very problematic point for me. The police is behaving as if their version is the final version. Is that the job of the police, to say that this is my version and everyone who disagrees with my version will now have proceedings against them? Is it not the job of the police to investigate and leave that decision for a court? Is the police here giving a verdict?
Yeah, Faye, first of all, let me congratulate you because you raised a very, very sensitive issue, very, very timely. And I'm very happy I've heard the version of these two, very, very respectable journalists. Let me say at the very outset that a case like this is very, very sensitive. And because of the background and because of the atmosphere which prevails in UP right now and the impending elections, everything becomes, it's like a tinderbox waiting to explode. And therefore, we need a greater maturity from both sides. Journalists who are reporting, as also the policemen who are instituting cases. I totally agree with you. When a case like this, technically, any victim comes with any complaint, the FIR has to be lodged according to that version in the same language, and then the investigation starts. Now, in this case, because the Twitter war started before and the policemen realized that they are under pressure, they had to give their version immediately that no, this amulet, case was there. Actually, it had nothing to do with that. So, it's a very difficult kind of thing to really arbitrate upon. Now, Radhika ji said a very important point that when we look into a victim's complaint, we look at it with a little bit of skepticism. That's what the policemen also do in every case. And we see how much of it is stretched and how much is the reality. In this case, I would only say that if the policemen did not have anything to verify, for example, she rightly said that after the victim's statement, we go to the police. If the police doesn't have a version at that time, they could have easily said, we are not aware of it, we are investigating into it. And if at all they came to a conclusion in 2-3 days later, the job was done. So technically, I would say legally, the FIR is not tenable. That's right. That's right. It's not tenable because strictly speaking, the journalist heard something from the victim and they reported it. I would only, have expected one thing, a little bit of much more maturity, saying that, yes, he was thrashed, everything was come out, and he also made an allegation and they know how to do it. A little more muted that part, because obviously this is something which leads to a communal conflagration. And UP has been suffering. There are goons who are out there who are indulging in these lynchings. So this is a kind of thing which would have made no difference in any other country, in any other state also for that matter. If
Am
I were the police officer, I would have admitted, yes, I don't know the facts right now. I would verify and get back to you. In the meantime, I mean, you just be a little, fair. And many a times the journalists always cooperated with me. So it's a sad incident, but definitely the case registration is going a little too far. It was not at all necessary.
In fact, Mr. Azad, let me just bring in Pratik Sinha to respond to that point that you made. It's a very important point because journalists have language that we are taught to use. We use language like allegedly, as alleged, or has claimed. My understanding, though, is that Mohammed Zubair at least had used that language in his tweet. He said the victim claims he was asked to, shout these slogans.
I want to add one more thing.
One
more thing. Firstly, if you look at the timeline of things, the crime actually happened on June 5th. Okay.
Yes.
Zubair and everybody tweeted post June 14th. Nothing was moving till then. In terms of, they had arrested one person whose name was, I think, Parvesh Gujjar, and nothing was moving. And then what happened was eventually, I don't know the political side of things, but the victim went to a Samajwadi Party leader, did a live video where he made these allegations. And then this was put out on, eventually it came to Twitter. Now, FIR has also done a story where they have shown a police complaint. The police is alleging that this person never said anything about the communal bit, and it is not in the FIR. That is the very basis that, look, the FIR does not have it, and which is why whatever the journalists are putting out is false. Now, FIR did a story where they're showing a police complaint, a handwritten police complaint dated June 6th, in which these allegations are made. And in a News Laundry story, the police is saying that the complaint is forged, but from what I have seen, it apparently was done on June 6th. Now these timelines are very important, when the crime happened, when the FIR was registered, when the arrests were made, and eventually this issue blew up, and the police speeded up the investigation only when things came out on social media. And that we have seen again and again, where very often, because social media starts talking about it, then things sometimes speed up. And the second thing I want to talk about is the language that was used in most cases. For example, Zubair, he specifically did not, the allegation against him is that he communalized the issue. Number one, never once did he specify the religion. He said that goons beat up this person, which has no religion associated with it. And second, he said that this is what the victim is claiming. It was very, very respectable language, and he is accused number one in the FIR. So I mean, the way I understand how things work, as I said, Times Now came out with the show before Zubair did. All the articles are about Zubair, whether it's all the right-wing leaning portals like Op India, etc. There's a concerted attack on Zubair. There's a trend which is called Ban Alt News. So from what work I have done in all this time, this is not because journalists have committed crime. This is because this is a targeted attack on certain individuals. If this was such an issue, why isn't there an FIR against Times Now? If the issue is of language which is not proper, the first FIR should have been on Times Now, because they have used language which is much more quote unquote irresponsible than what Zubair did. So the issue is not here at all of who used what language. The issue is a targeted attack on certain individuals. As I said, Saba Naqvi tweeted an Indian Express article, So where is the crime in tweeting an Indian Express article? The names in the FIR are part of a design. This is not because they have done something wrong. If the issue was that they have done something wrong, then there would have been many other names in the FIR and not just 6 Muslim names.
I want to bring in Radhika ji on this, because there is language like we talked about the journalists are supposed to use. There's reporting the journalists are supposed to do. Do you believe that FIRs of this nature have a chilling effect on the people who do this job? Because tomorrow I'm going to say, you know what, let's avoid all of these stories. Let's not report these stories. Let me wait 5 days until all of this back and forth becomes clear. everybody accepts one version, then I'll report it. What impact does that have on the profession and the job that the profession is supposed to do?
Well, obviously, the whole message is to silence the press and especially social media, which is kind of filling a vacuum, if you've seen increasingly in the recent past or for the past few years, papers have been extremely wary about reporting on what is deemed as a sensitive incident, which has social ramifications, relations between communities and allegedly hurting religious sentiments and so on. If they either blank such incidents out or take a very a very conservative line, which is essentially reporting only the official version. And since I'm actively in touch with Uttar Pradesh journalists, they've been telling me that, look, the press here is silenced. I said, how? Apart from Dainik Bhaskar, no other paper talked about the bodies. I'm just giving an instance, bodies being washed up on the Ganga. It was left to a Lucknow journalist, Britesh Mishra, who does some very good online reporting, to first break the story that, bodies are being washed up on the Ganga, banks of the Ganga. And then social media picked it up, and then certain individual journalists started reporting on that. But I noticed through this phase that the mainstream media was extremely wary of reporting even that particular case. So to come back to what my Lucknow friends have been saying, they said, look, under this dispensation, we are forced to withdraw. We cannot write on anything, whether right through the pandemic, whether it was O2 shortage, whether it was a directive from the government asking for patients to produce referrals from government, from district medical officers or the chief medical officer before they got admission in to private hospitals. I was looking only at Brijesh Mishra's reports to find out what was happening on the ground. Or there was a directive issued to diagnostic laboratories to stop testing. That was in April. So none of this found its way in the mainstream media. You can check for yourself, the local, the Lucknow papers, the UP papers. So each incident, and mind you, this goes back to 2019, I think, when Prashant Kanodia was arrested in 2019 and in 2020. There were other cases also in the districts. In Jhansi, a certain journalist was arrested for reporting on some scam in the midday meal scheme and so on. So each such arrest, each such case of victimization is meant to silence the media and coerce the media into submission. And that's exactly what has been happening in Uttar Pradesh. In this case, very interesting, they have targeted the non-Uttar Pradesh media because all the journalists who have been named are not from Uttar Pradesh. They are either from Delhi or Bombay. And that is only because the Uttar Pradesh media is too scared to report on anything. So, the regime's purpose has been served. It doesn't even have to now worry about the local media except for a couple of journalists. So this is the state of the media in Uttar Pradesh. I'm taking Uttar Pradesh as an example because it is the worst offender in this particular instance.
Mr. Azad, A, do you want to respond to that? And secondly, the question also of if people wanted, and this is another thing that I'll take to Pratik later, that every time something like an FIR like this is filed against certain journalists, there is a troll army of Twitter who then descends on these journalists and then calls them names and trolls them and basically asks for their arrest. But is it fair to say that over the last couple of years, several state police have displayed evidence that they actually work at the behest of the government of the day, whether that is in Maharashtra, which has faced accusations repeatedly, with the whole Sachin Wazir case, whether it is Uttar Pradesh, any, all of these sort of state police actually serve the politicians of that state and not really the people. In that case, is it fair to take what the police say as the final word?
Well, two parts to your question. First, let me say that I would hesitate from making such a strong value judgment that which has been mentioned by Pratik and also Radhika ji. I would say that this case became highly sensitive because of two reasons. One, as Pratik already mentioned, that the Samajwadi leader was involved, and so the backlash started from the other side. Samajwadi Party's leanings are well known, and the opposition to almost everything is very well known. And the BJP trollers are always there. There's a large army there, which sort of, when it counterattacks, it really goes for the kill. And second is the chanting, alleged chanting of Iran. I wish the journalists had also given equal weightage to the coverage of that amulet thing of, whatever that was there, how much money was spending, and when was that given, and what really happened. So this is exactly why this case became very, very hot. Secondly, because of the Twitter involvement, and you know how the government is arraigned against Twitter right now, and the Twitter has given another statement to Parliament Committee today, and that has raised the hackles again because they are going by their own norms. So this thing became very, very active. Now, as far as this case is concerned, whether the police is acting at the behest of the state, unfortunately, police reforms in this country will remain a chimera. Because as I've already said on your forum, that if in any country the grassroots politics moves around the thanas and tehsils and those blocks and all that, there can never be a reform. And for that, we are all responsible for it, because we don't fight for honesty, integrity, and those individuals who are there in the system. Now, in this case, there are many of these UAPA cases which have been filed, and I don't agree with them. In UP, for example, against journalists, is ridiculous. It's sedition cases, which should never be there. Any conscientious police officers will not file those cases. And during my time, these cases were not filed at all. In fact, your democracy is supposed to be very, very fragile. If every second day there is a UAPA case being, instituted or a sedition, that means you're not a stable country. You're collapsing. And that's why you're having so many cases. Now, in this case, I think the case was registered correctly of the victim's case against whatever it was. But against the journalists, it went too far because the state has to be large-hearted, in a democracy. That's all I would say. I mean, this is certainly not the kind of thing that you would institute. And then, of course, the government could have approached the Editors Guild, approached those journalists and given their version of it. And I'm sure these journalists are highly mature people and they would have agreed. If I'm not mistaken, alt news is supposed to be the gold standard where people go to test the veracity of a particular report and things like that. So in fact, I quoted them when we were talking about the manipulated tweet of this Congress. They said that they had seen it. So this is my view. I would refrain from a very strong value judgment, and I would say I wish there were more sagacity and maturity from both sides.
In fact, I must point out to our audience that Siddiqui Kappan, the journalist from Kerala who has been in jail now for 6 months, faces sedition and UAPA, which is the Terror Act, for getting on a bus and going to Uttar Pradesh to report on the Hathras case. His mother passed away today while Siddiqui is still in jail. He's been in jail for the last 6 months. He has not been able to see his mother. I mean, as a journalist, it broke my heart to read that story, really. Yes.
Yeah, and the thing is that, Siddiqui was arrested even before he reached Hathras. He didn't even file a report on Hathras, where the cops or the state could have said that he's reported falsehoods and he's made baseless allegations and so on. He wasn't even given an opportunity to report. And before that, you made up your mind to arrest him because they allege that he has links with an extremist group, which hasn't been proved until today. The charges against Siddiqui Kappan have not been proved until today. So this was purely a case of prejudging somebody's credentials even before the person who is a journalist. I mean, I know Siddiqui Kappan, and he's covered the BJP for long years. It's you sort of presume that just because he has a certain name and a surname, he has to be connected with the terrorist group. I mean, those are the kind of prejudices, the biases under which the state operates.
In fact, Mr. Ramaseshan, that's the question I wanted to ask you, which is 6 months. 6 months this man has been in jail. The police, as of yesterday, could not, actually complete its investigation with regard to disturbing of peace, and the court dismissed that one particular charge. But there are many other charges: sedition, the terror charge, without any evidence. 6 months the man is in jail. The activists who were released yesterday were in jail for a year. I mean, this is the system right now, and that brings me back to the chilling effect, where, like Pratik's colleague, you know that if tomorrow the police arrest you, it will be 8 months to a year, even if you're completely innocent. Before you,
I want to add something here.
Yes, Pratik, go ahead.
So number one, regarding what Mr. Azad said, that the amulet version should have been specified. Now again, I would say that minutes after police put out their version, Zubair tweeted that version in that thread. He's like, this is what the victim has said. 3 tweets of what the victim had said. 4th tweet was that this is what the police has said. Again, never attributing anything ever to religion. Okay. Now I want to read out one tweet by Mr. Shalabmani Tripathi, who is the media advisor for Mr. Yogi, and tell me, because we're talking about chilling effect, tell me what does this sound like. Mr. Shalabmani Tripathi quote tweets Zubair and says, Filhal, and he puts a picture of men with huge guns. Okay. And he says, Filhal UP police pata talash rahi hai. Pehle apna pata batao, ye khel ab nahi चलेगा, दंगाई अफवाह फैलाओ, मकसद पूरा होते ही चुपके से ट्वीट डिलीट कर रफू चक्कर हो जाओ. Okay, now this is the media advisor of Mr. Yogi Adityanath openly on Twitter threatening my colleague, saying कि पता बताओ तुम्हारा. Okay, who is he to threaten my colleague? Why is he threatening my colleague कि तुम अपना पता बताओ? This is happening openly on Twitter. So you talk about chilling effect, because I said that people do things in self-preservation because we know that these things happen. And which is why people do things in self-preservation. This is open threat on Twitter. A person who works with the CM of Uttar Pradesh is threatening my colleague openly on Twitter, ki pata batao tumhara. So, I mean, what else is this? This is, and if we do not acknowledge this now, that this is what, I'm not, I'm not casting blame on the police. I do know for a fact that, that the decision to file FIRs against the people who it was done was not done where it was actually filed. The decision was made elsewhere. And the same people are threatening my colleague on Twitter openly. So what is this? I mean, we have to acknowledge this.
Yeah, perhaps it's a bit too late, Mr. Sinha, because I think if the UP press, if the UP media had stood up to the strong arm tactics from the beginning, if there was solidarity among that is very important among the press fraternity, maybe the government may just have been forced to take a few steps, step back a bit. I don't see, because given the nature of the Yogi Adityanath dispensation and the kind of media setup that he has, I am not very optimistic that would have happened. But on the other hand, it was incumbent on the UP media to stand up to strong arm tactics that were enforced right from the beginning. What you are seeing right now, happening to Mohammed, Zubair and Saba and the others, is not very new. It has happened to other journalists. And this is because it is the national press that's involved. It's probably got more coverage. But in the boondocks, in the hinterland, journalists have been threatened. They've been victimized. They have even been put in jail. You saw a bit of an outcry at times. That was again in the national media, but the UP press has remained frighteningly silent. And that's what disturbs me.
Radhika ji, do you expect a lot more of this in the next 7 to 8 months going into the Uttar Pradesh elections? Do you expect a larger rift or a divide from administration between religions and communities?
It's not about religions. It is about it's about these vigilante groups that have cropped up everywhere under different names. They're not necessarily RSS or BJP. I'm not trying to implicate the RSS or the BJP. There are various groups like the Hindu Sena and so on, which are kind of openly threatening you and intimidating members of a particular community, or even Hindus. Dissenting Hindus are not having it very good. You did see a video of a woman who tried to resist giving chanda to the Ram Bhakts who were collecting money for the Ram temple. And she was bullied. That video was there. It was not a journalist who recorded it. It was somebody in the neighborhood who did, and it was put out. So, you are going to see a lot more of these incidents because typical of the BJP, they will play the communal card to the hilt and try and polarize communities in order to, get another term, so to speak, because that's the only card they have. Somebody said that there are 2 C's that the BJP is going to use in Uttar Pradesh, caste and corona. So I added a third one. I said communalism is going to be the underpinning of the BJP's politics in Uttar Pradesh. Caste and the pandemic will come later, because what do they have to say to commend themselves about in pandemic management? It has been mismanagement through and through. There are really no 2 ways about it, no matter what the chief minister claims right now about using a model template and so on. There was no template to begin with. The consequences were disastrous, as we saw. So I really wonder what he is going to say about pandemic management. Caste, yes, the BJP social engineering is excellent. They've become very skilled at it. So they will play around with the various caste configurations and combinations and permutations. But the overlay is definitely going to be communalism, because it works in Uttar Pradesh. Unlike Bengal, UP is a highly communalized state, and it mostly works for the BJP. So you are going to see incidents, and you don't need dog whistles. You do not need dog whistles from the top. It's kind of permeated right down to the ground, and the people are taking this in their hands and doing this kind of thing.
A technical question for Mr. Azad. Somebody on our our chat window has said that will these people like Zubair and Saba Naqvi take responsibility if the tweets lead to a kind of riot in Loni? And I want to just move that into a question that is a little more technical. Is it not true, Mr. Azad, that these sort of FIR should actually be filed when there is an incidence of violence, and then connecting the statement made to the incidence of violence, that this statement actually led to the flaring up of emotions? Isn't that how these FIRs are meant to be used? And if the police were to then randomly file FIRs against anyone who writes things on Twitter, I can give you thousands of examples of horrific things that are written on Twitter, examples of things that are said on Clubhouse, where people say horrific things. But in this case, has the police sort of selectively found a way to use the law? Would you tell us technically how this law is meant to be used? Effectively inciting offense.
Well, this is 153 is, of course, means that incitement to disaffection and communal disharmony and things like that. Well, for the prevention, if they feel that there is a kind of a communal disharmony which is going to be generated or which has been generated, and they have substance to it, they have some evidence to it, then it's fine. But I agree with you that this, and I've already said before, this FIR was a little premature. And obviously, if something would have happened, you have to connect that, this thing links to that, and that is why that happened. On the other hand, I'll still maintain that on reporting on issues which have a communal overtone, which can have a communal flare-up. Journalists should be very, very careful. And I think this is something which is taught in your journalist ethics, to the language used and all that. And as long as you've used it correctly, then you should stand by your word. You should fight for it and prove that what you said was right. Because today there's another version that the police investigation is a kind of a papered version of what is happening, what has actually happened. The journalists stand by what they have said, that the victim maintained that his beard was cut and he was asked to chant something. Whereas the police says the actual matter was a monetary dispute and they took action, and there were mixed community on both sides or something like that. So if I agree with Radhika ji that the UP journalists should have stood their ground also, who have quietened themselves. And secondly, I mean, then they should, go for it and stand by according to their strength, because you have to suffer for truth.
Yes, I want to bring Pratik Sinha back here, at this point to respond to this. Pratik, also, let's remember that the government right now has locked horns with Twitter as a platform and is also attempting to illustrate that Twitter is no longer an intermediary and is in fact a publisher and should be held accountable for anything that is written on its platform. Do you think there may be a chance that these FIRs are just a way to send a message to Twitter that, hey, this is how we're going to treat you if you don't follow our instructions?
No, so Twitter is also a target because the same videos are on Instagram and Facebook. The government doesn't seem to be upset about other platforms carrying the same video, but they're upset about Twitter. So there is some political battle going on there between the government and Twitter. And again, all of this points to selective action. If the same video is there on Facebook and Twitter, why isn't Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad writing a 10-tweet thread against Facebook and Instagram? He's not doing that. He's doing that specifically for Twitter. And and I would want to comment on this thing that, the journalists have to suffer for truth. No, why should journalists suffer for truth? We're not supposed to suffer for truth. We're supposed to report what happened, and we're not supposed to suffer for that. So I think that is an unfair expectation on journalists.
Pratik, this is really important, and I don't know how many people realize this, that every day journalists are faced with the reality that you might have to go to jail, that your family will be left running pillar to post, finding a lawyer to defend you, finding a way to make sure that you're safe in jail. How real has that become for you personally? Because this idea that journalists have to suffer for the cause is, it's starting to become really real, right?
Somebody has filed a police complaint against me today in Ghaziabad. Why? Because somebody from News Nation called me, said that, asked me, where is Zubair? I said, Zubair is not available for comment. Had a conversation with me. It was not an on-the-record conversation. Played that recorded phone call on News Nation. And now somebody has gone and filed a police complaint. It's not an FIR, it's a police complaint. It has not been converted into an FIR. But somebody from RSS has gone and filed a police complaint against me in Ghaziabad. What is the charge? That I have defended Zubair. The charge is that I have defended Zubair. And that is why they have gone and filed a police complaint. So it is every day there's a threat. Every day, anytime there's even the slightest chance that, that they could see our demise, they celebrate. Even there's a slightest chance that they can see that, there's a slightest chance that, okay, these guys can possibly, go to jail in this case. There's celebration. So this is an everyday thing.
And, this is my last question. I want to take this to Radhika ji. Do you believe journalists should suffer for the cause? I know that, the truth is our weapon, but should journalists be faced with the reality that we're facing today? And I also want to ask you, in your career, which spans a few decades, when was the last, has this always been the case? Is this different now than it was earlier?
This is different because I have worked under a BJP regime in Uttar Pradesh, the first BJP regime. So, the modus operandi was that if they found you uncomfortable, inconvenient, they wouldn't meet you. The ministers or the senior leaders would stop meeting you. Defamation was certainly one instrument that they used to put down the press. And again, the mode was to file cases in as many places over the country over, and not just in, say, Uttar Pradesh. If it was an incident pertaining to Uttar Pradesh, they would file a case in Kerala or Karnataka or wherever, so that, the owners would get intimidated and, force an apology. So so there were two instruments that they used: denying accessibility and filing defamation cases. There was no question of intimidation of this kind, not at all. Of course, when the Babri Masjid was demolished on that particular day, you did see you did see some extremely strong arm tactics being used in Ayodhya against journalists. They first went for the foreign journalists, and then they targeted those they thought were against them from the beginning. They were roughed up, physically roughed up. I mean, that was the only instance I remember where there was this kind of intimidation and assault and so on. And among those who was beaten up badly was a local journalist from Ayodhya, Suman Gupta. I mean, she was, they sort of dug a deep pit, and because she was a small built kind of petite person, they just threw her. I mean, people took her for dead. I mean, that was the kind of thing that we saw in Ayodhya on 6th December 1992. But after that, no, the BJP was, I never resorted to this kind of thing. But coming from Yogi Adityanath, I'm not entirely surprised, because journalists in Gorakhpur have been telling me that it wasn't very easy to work with him in Gorakhpur. It wasn't a question of denying accessibility or shutting off certain journalists. It was his Hindu Vahini vigilantes did threaten journalists. In fact, one of the local filmmakers has gone extensively on record to put certain things about Yogi Adityanath. So I'm not entirely surprised. And to your first question, of course not. Why should we suffer? I mean, we are doing our job. We should do our jobs honestly, accurately, give both multiple versions. I mean, you're not just two. If there are more than two versions, please bring in everything. Do kind of balanced reporting, which we have been doing. Don't pursue an agenda. I mean, it's not a question of being anti-BJP or pro-BJP or being a Hindutva-oriented person or a leftist or part of the Tukre gang. As journalists, we are working, we are supposed to work as journalists, and nobody should be made to suffer for it. No.
Absolutely. There's nothing actually to say after that statement, that journalists really shouldn't be made to suffer. It's a job. And it's a job that we hope will pay the bills, will pay the school fees, will put food on the table. It's a job like anybody else's job, like people who work in banks or people who work in government offices. I don't understand the need for journalists to sort of kill themselves over their job, or be killed over the job, or have to constantly face the threat of going to jail. And journalists have been doing their job since before independence. Remember, a lot of our freedom fighters were in some way journalists, because they wrote pamphlets and they wrote articles, which actually led to the fight for independence in India. So there's no reason now why journalists are being expected to sort of throw themselves on their sword in the general interest of being able to do this job. I'm going to leave it here. I do hope for the audience that this cleared up a lot of questions about the role of journalists, the role of the police, the role of the law in matters like this. At the end of the day, to put it very simply, the journalist's job is to bring you all the versions: the victim's version, the police's version, the family's version, the eyewitness version, the versions that develop and change after that, the versions that are recorded by the police, the versions that wind up in the dustbin when the police is filing the FIR and when they file that final investigation. The judgment of what is right and what is wrong, who is guilty, who is not guilty, is made by the court, not by the cops. So there's absolutely no situation in which the cops can turn around and file an FIR against someone for reporting a version, because it's not their version. Because nobody has said that the police's version is the truth. In fact, we have enough examples. We could go on perhaps for 4 hours of cases in which the police's version was not the truth, because the police has several people in the mildest sense to keep happy when they do their job as well. So we're going to leave it there. And if you have more questions, leave it for us in the comment section. And we'll try and bring in more experts to answer those questions for you. I want to thank my audience and my guests for making time to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.